So let's configure and test port security. In this example, I've got GNS3 running iOS vLayer 2. That's our switch in the topology. And then I've got a Cisco iOS router. It's a 3725 router image, which I'm using as the PCs in the topology. So router 1 will act as PC1 and router 2 will act as PC2. We'll configure MAC addresses on the routers and then change them to prove that port security works. MAC addresses with vendor code 002333 belong to Cisco systems. So we'll use this MAC address range so that we can see the output in Wireshark and create easy to read MAC addresses in the lab. The router and switch have booted up with no configuration. So I've made no configuration changes on these devices. Let's start off by naming this device switch 1. Router 1 is already configured and so is router 2 based on the default configuration in GNS3. But the switch has no configuration. So at the moment, if we type show port security, you'll notice that there's no output here because port security is not currently enabled. Show MAC address table shows that no MAC addresses have been learnt. So on router 1, let's configure fast Ethernet 00 with MAC address 00233300 0001, and I'll no shut that port. We'll do something similar on router 2. We'll just make this 2 rather than 1 and no shut the port. Show MAC address table shows us that the switch has learnt both these MAC addresses. So router 1 is available on gigabit 00, router 2 is available on gigabit 01. Both addresses were learnt dynamically. In other words, we didn't statically configure these MAC addresses. They have been dynamically learnt by the switch. Show port security still shows us that port security hasn't been enabled. We have no output. So going on to gigabit 00, let's try and enable port security. Notice the command is rejected, and that's because we're running dynamic trunking protocol or DTP on this port. We haven't statically configured this port as an access port or as a trunk port. So let's type switch port mode access, and we'll enable port security again. The command is now accepted. So show port security shows us that the secure port is gigabit 00. The maximum secure addresses allowed on the port is 1. By default, only a maximum of 1 MAC address is allowed on a port security port. How many MAC addresses have currently been learnt? Answer is 1. How many security violations have occurred? 0. And what security action will be taken if there's a violation? The port will be shut down. In other words, it will be error disabled. We'll look at some of the other options in a moment, but let's see what happens. Show port security. Let's look at some options. Address. So here's the secure MAC address table. On VLAN 1, this MAC address has been learnt. The type is secure dynamic. We dynamically learnt about the address. The port is gigabit 00. The remaining age is a hyphen. You can determine how long a MAC address that is learnt is remembered before it's aged out on a port. Now notice this example is not restricting this port to specific MAC addresses. It's limiting the port to 1 MAC address. We didn't statically configure the port. So show run interface gigabit 00 shows us that we enabled port security, and that's all we did. We didn't statically configure a MAC address. But if we change the MAC address on this port to, let's say, 3, let's see what happens. As soon as the port came up, we get an error disable message. port security violation error detected on gigabit 00. The port is now being put into error disabled state. A security violation occurred, caused by this MAC address. Notice ending in 3 on port gigabit 00. The line protocol has gone down. So show interface gigabit 00. There's the command, shows us that the port is down, and the reason for that is error disable. The port was error disabled. Port has gone down. This router, and let's give it an IP address, will not be able to send traffic to this device. So router 2 acting as PC2, because the port is down. Show port security. Please note this is not the status of the port. This is the action that's taken when there's a violation. Show port security interface gigabit 00 shows us that port security is enabled on the port. The status is secure shutdown. The violation mode is shut down. This is the last MAC address that was seen on the port. Only one MAC address is allowed. The violation count is 1. And that's because the MAC address that's allowed on that port, which is not shown here because the port has gone down, I'll just scroll up to show you the output, was this MAC address, and we've changed the MAC address. So ending in 0001 is the MAC address that's permitted, but this is the last MAC address that was seen that caused a violation. So let's change the MAC address back to 1, and on this side we'll go onto the port and shut it down, and then wait for that to go down, and then no shut it. Show port. You can see that show port security. Before I press enter, notice the port has come up. So port has come up. Secure MAC addresses is 1. At the moment it hasn't learnt a MAC address. Let's do a ping to router 2. As you can see now, it's now learnt a MAC address. So now the pings succeed. Show port security shows us that the max MAC address allowed is 1. Current address is 1, so 1 has been learnt. Let's look at the interface again, so gigabit 00. At the moment there is no violation. The port status is secure up. The violation mode is to shut the port down, but currently the port is up. Scrolling back up. Previously, notice it was secure shut down based on the violation mode of shutdown, but now it's secure up because the correct MAC address has been learnt, which is this MAC address. So notice here, the first MAC address that was received was added to the list of permitted MAC addresses. It was dynamically learnt, so you would have to ensure that the right MAC address is received on the port. If you reboot the switch, that information is lost, so the first host that's connected to that port will be permitted, and that may not be what you want. You may want to explicitly permit only certain MAC addresses associated with certain machines. So let's have a look at that.